Good afternoon. My name is Niamh Kirk and I had the privilege of working on this data for the past couple of months. As Ireland's first year participating with Reuters and examining national news consumption and how it's valued, we wanted to look at how Ireland fit into the international trends that emerged in this and previous years' reports. But we also wanted to focus on attributes that were particular to Ireland. The Irish are digitally immersed, but the strength of the traditional market hints at the complexity of the situation. It's far more dynamic than simply the triumph of some media and the demise of others. We had a number of interesting findings, particularly when we compared traditional and digital media, when we examined how the Irish pay for news and how they find news, and also the variety of media that they are exposed to. I'm going to elaborate on these a little bit more later. There are a lot of graphs in the report, and I've pulled just a few out for the purposes of this presentation. But if you'd like to follow through the document, there are some page numbers and the figures are included on the graphs to come. But first, it is important for me to explain how we got here. I'm going to take you very quickly through our approach and methodology. The first step was to examine the survey itself, designed by Reuters and the BAI. It was administered by YouGov and Research Now. And it is a data set on a scale and depth that we've never had before available on the Irish news consumption and usage. It was designed to probe the Irish news consumers across the topics that were mirrored in the other 11 participating countries, and this facilitated the cross-country analysis. As Ireland's first year, we don't have the historic trends, so we sought for the report to be descriptive, but with direct reference and consideration of the international patterns. We took some of the most salient topics, offering a broad view, and then included some in-depth insights. We aimed for it to be useful to both industry and academia, and not everything could be included, but the data set is large and further research projects are no doubt on the way. I'll just briefly take you through four of our main headline findings. Our entry point into the data was to describe traditional and digital news and to compare them. The main findings that emerged here was that Ireland had passed a tipping point and that overall digital news and online engagement was most common. But traditional sources are still quite pervasive. They're often people's main source, if not seeing the most exposure over a week. In this graph, it illustrates that level of diversity, online newspapers, pure digital players, asking people any of the platforms that they had used. Traditional sources and those online tend to be more highly used and more highly valued, as we saw on the brands list. They command an awful lot of the audience's attention and trust, and this places those who publish across both at an advantage in terms of reach. However, with the exception of the journal.ie, digital-born players have captured smaller corners of the Irish market, and this is growing. We see this complex dynamic between traditional and digital throughout our examinations, but it is not unproblematic. The age difference across generations, with the younger more digitally inclined and older geared more towards traditional, underlines a need to inspect the content of these two platforms to determine if the public debate being played out in each is the same or if it's slightly different. This generation difference also emerges elsewhere in device usage. Ireland is already at the forefront of smartphone usage internationally. However, older generations are largely using computers, while smartphone is more prevalent among younger age groups. So in summary, the digital market is on top, but the traditional market is far from being entirely usurped, and it's frequently more valued, if not more commonly used. But there is a slightly different demographic accessing both platforms, and this is important to consider in terms of news delivery. The second area I'd like to look at is also paying for news. Funding of digital journalism is one of the principal critical issues that has been examined each year in the international report. And with the data showing a global growth in digital news, along with the decline in print, critical issues around the funding of journalism and the monetizing of content come to the fore. In this report, we focus largely on print and digital content. I should say, though, the data in this report does not aim to equate to true readership figures or to true sales payment figures made for the period. In paying for print, the data is interesting. It was indicated by 6% of people to be their main source, but as we saw, it has a much larger reach across a given week. And even more people are buying newspapers, albeit they're not necessarily reading them. We can also expect some of these figures to be slightly higher. As noted, the survey underrepresents traditional media. So paying for print is popular, but online is most common, although paying for it is not. The low level of paying for digital news, along with the expression of unlikeliness to pay in the future, stood out in contrast to Ireland's pervasive digital engagement. We have among the highest levels of engagement, but the lowest levels of payment. And among those 7% who do pay, one-off payments are by far more common, as opposed to a movement towards digital subscriptions. And this does not promise to be a stable revenue stream. And although there is a slightly higher willingness among younger generations to pay in the future, broadly speaking, it seems that the climate is largely averse to paying for digital news. TV licenses subsidise the public service broadcaster across TV, online and on radio. And aside from the cost of private internet connections, there is a large degree and wide selection of free online news sources available, which might point to some of the reasons for this. How to engender more likeliness and more willingness to pay for digital news if it is to be a sustainable source emerges as a major challenge facing digital media leaders in Ireland. It should be noted that this survey was completed before the irishtimes.com, the fourth most popular digital news brand, introduced a paywall, so it will be interesting to see where the payment levels and where the likeliness go from here next year. The next area I'd like to draw your attention to is that of news plurality. While the survey did not ask specifically about plurality, the data set did allow us to ask some questions of it and to rework it in such a way to provide some illustrations from the perspective of audience exposure. We color-coded the brand list to offer a visual representation. It is not exhaustive, but it does help give an idea of the level of diversity and pervasiveness of media ownership in the market. In terms of dominance, RTE was on top of both the digital and traditional spectrum. Independent titles, Irish Times, BBC and Sky, all large-scale producers of original journalism, are popular in both the digital and traditional spectrums. But we noticed on the traditional list, we see the presence of international brands and Sky among the top tiers. While in digital brands, it is exclusively dominated by 4 Irish original producers. Some national, but more international digital-born players are making headway into the Irish market. I think this brand list gives a nuanced picture. Not only can we see the broad levels of news diversity and ownership, but we also see the degree of exposure to news media across the different levels, national and regional. And while national news and producers are quite important, it is important to consider the strength of the regional across print and on radio. The fourth and final area I'd like to look at is how the Irish find news. Although search and direct access is most common in Ireland, social media's role in finding news is growing internationally. It's already at 36% in Ireland. And Ireland already shows above average usage for social networks and for use in news. So we thought that it warranted more attention. Facebook dominates the social media usage for news. And Facebook's subsidiary, WhatsApp, although more a private messaging service, is also quite popular, followed by YouTube and Twitter. There are some important distinctions to consider, though. While Facebook emerges as popular for more casual news users, Twitter is best for targeting interested and frequent news users, or those categorized as news lovers. Outside the main brands, messaging service Viber stood out in Ireland across brands and also stood out for use internationally. The difference between general usage and that for use for news indicates that social networks are primarily used for their core purpose of communicating with friends. And secondarily, that's where they pick up news. The Irish, like most, prefer to talk interpersonally about news, and even online more one-on-one. But given the overall high levels of engagement and interest, and our reputation as talkers, it may come as no surprise that Irish participation and discussion in online news is comparatively high. Almost a third share news, while a quarter will comment on it. National cultural attributes can be digitised too. And for political analysts and those reporting online, it is worth noting that about 16% of people take part in online polls. So the situation is dynamic. International trends are replicated in some countries, and they do provide a rich context, but there are also unique national attributes. In Ireland, digital outweighs traditional, but it's a close contest. And even in the face of international trends, there is still a lot to play for. There is room yet for innovation in the parts of the industry where there is still a lot of popularity and a long reach, but are facing challenges in terms of competition and funding. It is dynamic, but not unproblematic. The audience is slightly different across traditional and digital news, which calls for an examination of content. Paying for news everywhere emerged as a challenge. It was no higher than 14%, but Ireland is among the lowest levels and showing among the most unlikely. This is a challenging environment for the engenderment of digital subscriptions if they are to take over from daily newspaper purchases as a revenue stream. The Irish have embraced the digital era and how it facilitates news access and consumption, and in many ways we've passed a tipping point. But we've retained strong ties to traditional media, and trends are not replicated homogeneously across every country. So next year promises to bring even more insight into this vibrant environment. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.